Hello, we're going to be covering the Cold War in this lecture. Cold War essentially runs from 1945 to 1991. It is predicated on the idea that the United States had become an atomic power in 1945, and the Soviet Union was quickly trying to catch up. This comic pretty much identifies the Cold War in a nutshell. You'll see the soldiers on each side throwing old-fashioned arrows at one another while standing in front of the H-bomb, the Z-bomb, the Y-rocket, all that kind of good stuff. And the idea here is that if we use a nuclear weapon or an atomic weapon on one another, we're going to destroy the world. So it became a Cold War because we didn't actually use any weaponry. We were just spying on one another and racing through the technological minefield to try and be superior. The Cold War was a time after World War II when the USA and the Soviet Union were rivals for world influence. On one side, you had the United States, France, Great Britain, West Germany, and they were all believing that capitalism was the way to run your economy. The Soviet Union, or all countries controlled by the Soviet Union, which was most of the Eastern Bloc of Europe, believed in communism, which basically the difference between capitalism and communism is capitalism believes that business is in the pursuit of profit. Communism believes that everyone should share equally in the proceeds that the country has. One of the major issues, of course, as I mentioned, was the development of weapons of mass destruction. When the U.S. used the atomic bomb against the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it signaled to the world that a new type of weapon could literally destroy the world. And the Russians were moving to catch up. The Soviet atomic community work began on a weapons program as early as 1943. The United States had started working on their nuclear program even before we entered the war, but we were really in earnest by 1941, 1942. So we were ahead of the Russians there. It was slow going because it was a very expensive endeavor, and the Soviet Union had been at war for 4 years. Remember that the war in Europe started in 1939. We, as the Americans, didn't really get into it until the beginning of 1942. So they had been dealing with war for many more years than the United States had. And of course, war is a very expensive endeavor. It took the USSR 6 years to test their first fission bomb. It was called Joe 1. We enter the policy of mutually assured destruction. This is the belief that an all-out nuclear war would be unwinnable. A nuclear war would destroy the infrastructure of a country. And just to kind of give you the context, this is Hiroshima after the blast. It's literally leveled. Ironically, the threat of nuclear weapons helped maintain the peace because neither nation dared attack for fear of retaliation. It was truly this belief that if we sent a bomb to Moscow, they would send a bomb to Washington, D.C. and essentially destroy the capital. There are several very specific sites that were being identified. For example, one of the big sites in the United States is in Colorado because a lot of our weapons system computers are in mountains in Colorado hidden away. Of course, the bigger cities like New York, Los Angeles, even Philadelphia, big seats of government were also identified. Now, another issue was the fact that when Hitler was defeated, the Russians got to Berlin before the Americans or the British. And as such, the communists or the Soviet Union claimed the eastern part of Germany and the eastern part of Berlin as their new property. This is what they were claiming. And the Soviets, to kind of really ensure that the West understood their intentions, built a wall down the center of Berlin to keep communists from escaping to the American sector and the Berlin Wall. It is a very ugly cement wall covered in barbed wire that were essentially to keep the Russians or the communists on one side and the capitalists on the other side. This is Harry Truman, and he developed what's known as the Truman Doctrine, which he put forth in March of 1947, promising the U.S. would support free peoples who were resisting communism. And this led to the containment policy. This is where we contain communism where it is. In other words, we're not going to let it spread. The fear was the domino theory. The fear was that communism would spread like a disease, or like when you see dominoes pushing one another until they all fall down. China had already become communist, Korea was well on its way, and so on and so forth. And what they were worried about is all of Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia, when we get to this end, was going to turn communist. This all comes to a head in 1950 when communist North Korea troops invade South Korea. Poorly armed, the South Koreans were no match for the North. The United Nations ordered North Korea to withdraw its troops, and American General Douglas MacArthur was appointed to command all UN troops in Korea. Therefore, the Korean War was not technically a war in the same way that World War I or World War II was. It was actually a UN police action, and as such, it had a variety of troops all working together. After 3 years of fighting a stalemate, more than 54,000 American troops died. That's a huge number in 3 years, keeping in mind that in the 11 years of our Iraq War, we lost about 6,000 soldiers. And of course, we didn't actually win. This was a stalemate, and what ended up happening is that North Korea stayed communist, South Korea stayed capitalist. China had invaded from the north to help the North Koreans fight the Americans and the other UN countries in South Korea. And we end up with this armistice line in 1953. Another element of the Cold War was the space race, and it was who was going to conquer space first. The first satellite and the first man in space were the Soviet Union. In 1957, they launched the Sputnik satellite, and in 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. What you have to keep in mind with this is that despite all of these advances by the Russians, the Americans had not been working too hard on this actual project. In Kennedy's inaugural speech in 1961, he promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And this seemed almost impossible. And, it was one of those things that literally drew the line in the sand for the Americans that this was going to happen. So the United States spent most of the 1960s trying to catch up to the Soviets with the Apollo program. And this all culminates in 1969 when Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. And he very, very famous statement, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Ah, the angels sing. The USA clearly won the space race. And since then, the Americans, the Soviets, the Chinese, all of these groups have actually come together and are working together on the International Space Station. So there's a little irony for you. Next, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we call this the Bay of Pigs. The CIA trained and funded an invasion of communist Cuba. The invasion failed, but it helped Castro strengthen his relationship with the Soviet leadership. In 1962, a U.S. spy plane discovered missile silos in Cuba. And what they discovered is that these missile silos contained Russian missiles. This is the closest the U.S. and the Soviet Union came to using the bomb. After extensive negotiations, the Soviets removed the missiles in Cuba, and in exchange, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba again. So, this was as close as we got in those 45, 50 years of the Cold War. And the major culmination in all this was the realization that these two major superpowers had to have a dialogue, had to have negotiations in order to avoid mutually assured destruction. The war ends in 1973 after a few things happen. First of all, it becomes very apparent that we are not going to win this war. Secondly, President Nixon had to resign because of Watergate. In a nutshell, Nixon, who was running for re-election, had some of his thugs break into the Democratic campaign office and steal their campaign plans. Not only was it bungled, they were caught, they were able to tie everything back directly to Nixon, who happened to record most of his meetings, which pretty much sunk him. He had to resign. His vice president took over. His vice president did two major things. His vice president was Ford. He first of all said that Nixon could not be prosecuted and pardoned him, and that caused a lot of consternation. But the second thing he did was he ended the war in Vietnam. And this pretty much draws the line in the sand, ending the Vietnam conflict. The U.S. did not win. Ironically, Vietnam has become a very capitalist country. It's become a country that is filled with tourist opportunities for people in Asia. So Vietnam didn't work out so well for the Americans. In the 1980s, we have Ronald Reagan, and he hated the communists. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And keep in mind that this is after Star Wars in 1977, so that pretty much the Soviets were placed in the Darth Vader school of fighting. The Americans went so far as to arm Afghanistan rebels who were fighting the Russians, which of course backfires because what happens in the aughts when we go to war with Afghanistan, they're using the same weaponry that Americans had supplied to fight the Russians. So now they were using it against us. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of Russia. He's a pragmatist, which means that he's not only realistic, he understands that to get things done, you have to make concessions. You have to compromise. And he realizes that the Soviet Union cannot afford its military spending. So in 1987, he meets with Reagan, and they agree to scale back the weapon systems, especially the nuclear arsenal. And this really signals the end of the Cold War, because now instead of spending all the money on building nuclear weapons, we are scaling back, which means we're saving money. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and that really does officially declare the end of the Cold War. But it's not until 1991 when the Soviet Union officially says communism is not working and they move towards a democracy. So this is where we're going to end the class, and this will be on your final exam. If you have any questions, please send me a text or an email, and have a great day.